Evening, everyone. Welcome to the fourth in our Holistic Justice Salon series. This evening, we're going to be discussing It's Like I'm Powerful with a little bit of tender, our self-care and healing conversation. I can say words. Please excuse me. So it is, as usual, myself, Ana Chelsea Velasco Sanchez, and my co-host, Alicia Crosby. Alicia, say hello.
Hey, y'all. It's good to be with you again.
So we have a lot to get into, and we're having a sort of abbreviated conversation on camera this evening so that we could have a more robust conversation off camera, considering this is such an intimate conversation. So for those of you that may watch this later, we apologize that it's a little bit shorter than you're used to, but it really is for the benefit of those that are participating in real time today. We're going to go ahead and jump right in with a reminder about what this whole series has been about and why we want to talk about this, why this is important to us. So we have done a lot of conversation up to this point. We really only have 1 week left. We've talked about interpersonal relationships or inter-community relationships, like across movement relationships. We've talked about boundary setting and knowing how to take care of people and get paid what you deserve, and show respect in terms of compensating people well. We've talked about, what else have we talked about, Alicia? I'm leaving something out.
I mean, I think that's a really good like overview of like what all we've gone over. I mean, we've been doing this now this is month 4, and we've had these conversations because at the end of the day, we want to see a more holistic form of justice come out. We want to see, not just like holistic in terms of wellness, like that's definitely like what people oftentimes go to when they think of holistic, but we think of it as being, comprehensive. Like, what does it mean, like, when justice seeking is more dynamic? So, like, yes, where wellness is a priority, but also with the relationships we forge with one another, both in our movement spaces and across our movement spaces, are taken into consideration. Yeah. So Ana Chelsea and I, like, we've been friends and colleagues and comrades, like, for a number of years now. And this series is our way of, like, just sharing what we've learned and reflecting on what all it is that we've had to navigate in order to help people interrogate, including ourselves, like what a new way forward could look like.
Yes. Yeah, I'm just to echo what Alicia is saying. That's my super Christianese coming out. I want to echo the echo of your echo. But just to reassert what Alicia is saying, this is holistic has really, there's 2 major understandings of it. There's this concept of holistic justice in legal spaces, and then there's a concept of holistic justice in more contemplative, mystic-oriented, earthy type of conversations in terms of self and, mind, body, soul. And I'm sort of grasping and searching for new language right now for what we're talking about, which, as Alicia said, is everything. It's the self, it's the interpersonal in terms of immediate community and those you work with in your particular movement space, and then across movements, how we build something that is not a binary, it's not an individual cause, but it's something that encompasses everything. And so that's why we wanted to have these conversations in order to do the really hard work that looks like working across movements and doing it well and doing it in a way that can be sustained. We have to talk about self-care and healing. And we have to talk about not just self-care, but community care, which is the conversation that often gets left out. And so we're going to get into that this evening. I want to start with, what is self-care? So we're going to go ahead and jump in. There's a quote that I had on my mind. I was ready for this conversation, and then I was talking with Alicia in our preparation, and before I could say the quote, she came out with it. So our minds were in the same headspace, which is Audre Lorde. You've probably heard this one that says, caring for myself is not a self-indulgence. It is a self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And the reason I want to open with that quote is, often in activist or justice-oriented spaces, we push this conversation, let alone the actual work, to the side for when we have more time, more energy, more capacity and resources for it, when in reality we would maybe have those if we did it. So reorienting our understanding of this as not something you do as a fun addition if you have the time, as a way to treat yourself, but as an act of political warfare, that it is part of justice work. I think that reorientation is the first step to doing it well. Now, in terms of what is self-care, Alicia, how do you understand self-care?
I mean, I think about the prioritization of wellness, and like, this is why I love Lord's quote, because, wellness, like, it's about like, yes, your health, right? But it's also like your state of being. It's about being having a positive state of being. And the reason why all of this is political is because there are like resources and policies and laws and initiatives that we need to take to engage in caring for ourselves and caring for our communities. And so yeah, like it's not like it's not some like frou-frou, like Anna Delcy and I have talked about like the use of that term, but it's not some like frou-frou, arbitrary, like careless, superfluous thing.
Yes.
It's serious and critical and necessary for the sake of our survival. Like, we have to consider, like, what does it mean for us to be well? What does it mean for us to take an active role in like in being, you know, physically, mentally, spiritually, economically healthy, and then having the resources to see all those things come to light.
Yes. And while I don't want us to make the mistake of implying that the purpose of self-care is only so that we can do more work, because it's not, because we deserve to be well and whole and healed and cared for ourselves and by our community, regardless of what we're creating, or what sort of degree of work that we're doing in movement spaces. We deserve that simply as human beings. That being said, it's also an issue of sustainability. The self-care is so that you can continue to do this work. And we've talked about how you sustain this movement, that's a part of holistic justice is sustainability. You can't do it if you're not well, not for long, or certainly not in a way where you're not harming others or yourself, and in turn harming the movement, because unhealthy people aren't going to do the work they could do if they were well. So it isn't, self-care is not simply so that you can be a cog in the machine and do the work, but it is definitely helpful.
Absolutely. What I found super interesting, like, so when I looked up like self-care in a dictionary, right? Because dictionary skills, you got to employ them. I found it really interesting. So like, citation is everything. So this is from the Oxford Dictionary. They shared that self-care is the practice of taking an active role in protecting one's own well-being and happiness, in particular during times of stress. And it was really interesting that they named, like, it's an active role, right? Like, it's ongoing. It's not like, hey, this is something that just happens. It's not happenstance. And even dictionaries, as truncated as some of those definitions can be, like, they made it their business to like outline the fact that no, this is active. Like, you take hold of this. And so that was just like a super cool thing. It's like, hey, go ahead, Oxford Dictionary. Like, let the people know that it's active. Let them know that this is something that you have to take possession of.
Yeah. I don't know. I've been watching their Twitter feed. They've gotten very
They're fun.
They're edgy, so they're pretty fun. I feel that might have been purposeful. So our first thing we want to jump into is talking about the things that precipitate the need for self-care, and touching on this a little bit when you mentioned that in times of stress, I think you said. So we're going to talk about trauma and burnout. Alicia is going to lead us a little bit in this conversation, but there are reasons we have to do this beyond just what we've produced, but also dealing with what we've experienced up until this point, or might be experiencing in this moment. Alicia, do you want to lead us into that conversation?
Yeah, I mean, like, when we talk about self-care, I mean, like, so we've already come to the understanding that like this is something that we're actively engaging in, but like, why? Like, why are we doing it? And like, yes, care is something that definitely is necessary when we're in a state of wellness, but especially it's something we need to take care of when something happens. And that something, like, oftentimes is like a trauma has occurred. So like, there's been like some type of event, there's been like some act of violence, right? And like, violence takes all different forms, all different shapes. So it could have been emotional violence, like spiritual, like, just the possibilities are endless, but something happened. And as a result, you now hold the world differently.
Yes.
And I think that it's really important for us to have these conversations around care and consciousness of self, because like, when we go through something, like, we're like the first people to know, oh shit, like something changed. And so whether it's that we're having some type of response, like being in like a physical locale, or like, we find ourselves being a little bit more reserved in how it is that we interact with people, find ourselves being like less trusting. Like, these are all things that are like trauma responses, because there's been like this traumatic event that's occurred. We're now adjusting ourselves and reorienting ourselves like to the outside world in order to like protect ourselves, like, as we navigate through. And so that being said, I think, self-care is incredibly important because, self-care after trauma, after a stressful event, it helps us reorient in a way where we can engage the world a little bit more fully, but we're mindful of like the fact that something did happen to us and we need care.
Yes. And recognizing that for many of us, the reason we've come to this work is trauma, is it a traumatic event or ongoing trauma? So, I mean, we can get into this later when we talk about community care, but we have to consider that as we're building movement spaces. That's that part of a self-care being active. It needs to also be proactive and not reactive too. You come in some point in the work that you're doing, your trauma starts to reveal itself, and now we're going to engage in self-care, as opposed to having that built into the culture of our movement spaces, because most likely you are coming in already traumatized. And then you're going to compound that because long hours, putting the movement above our own needs, that secondary trauma of hearing the stories and the pain of others, all of that is then compounding the trauma you already came in with. And so if you're not starting from a place of self-care, let alone like hopefully having something in place for when something begins to reveal itself, when the cracks start to show, I think that that's one of the places we need to start, is recognizing that trauma is sort of a given in this.
It is. I mean, especially as people come in from communities experiencing marginalization. So like, I mean, I think about like what it means to live underneath like the ongoing like trauma of racial subjugation, like in the United States of America. Like it is utterly exhausting. It's like, how many videos do we have to see of like if someone being killed, or recently like I saw something on BuzzFeed, right? Like the thing that you go to look at like BS like articles and like take quizzes on like what type of gummy bear you eat, like let you know what city you'll live in. They've got like a major news story about like a campground employee pulling out a gun on a Black couple who just wanted to have a picnic. It's like, God damn, like, can we live? Like that's trauma. I mean, and sometimes like, I don't know, with kind of lay understandings of trauma, like we think that it has to be like this, big event, but like for some of us, like the trauma is like ongoing and it doesn't let up. And so like the witnessing of like attacks on personhoods, maybe it's not our direct personhood, but it's the personhoods of people who look like us, who sound like us, who come from the places that we come from. Like all that shit is traumatic, and it changes like how we engage. And so like Anajali is absolutely 174%. We're going with like an overage here.
I love
It's correct in saying that like we all, like many of us, right? Like some folks, bless y'all, bless you, that like you haven't like had, to hold the world differently because of the ways that your personhood is attacked like on a daily basis. But many of us get into this because we want to alleviate those conditions of violence for other people, so they don't have to like to do that hard work of like reorienting and reshaping and I don't know, just like encountering the world like in a way where they gotta unpack shit.
Yeah. So we titled this section not just trauma, we titled it Trauma and Burnout. So now that we've sort of said a little bit about what trauma is, when you say burnout, what is it that you're trying to name there?
I think for me, when I think about burnout, I think of the whole like I'm done, right? Like and what doneness is for like people. And one of the things I want to say about trauma and burnout, I mean, and even what care looks like. None of these things are universal, right? Like they look different for us, like contextually, like our understandings of them shift things, and like and how it is, like again, like how we experience the world is how we experience the world. Yeah. And so what's burnout to me is not burnout to Anajali. Like how she deals with like being underneath like immense pressure and stress, and like what she needs to do to like disengage, like that's different. And even like, and I think that like maybe that's what I'm saying with burnout, it's not even just like disengagement. Sometimes burnout is like unintentional disengagement, where it's just
your
like
body's still there but you're not, sort of thing.
Your body's there, you're not, like your mind is elsewhere, like your intentions are elsewhere, you just not giving a shit. I mean, other folks burn out as them like blowing up.
Right.
Like where you're just so fed up, you're like, fuck everything. Flame on. It's like that Elmo gif with the flames
fire on.
Like that's what I see burnout is for some folks. I mean, I know for me that could be the case. Like I know like what my temper can be, and like, yeah, like for me, burnout may be burn all the things, make it all go away. Whereas for someone, it may be some degree of like, you know, dissociating and like their mind, you know, being where their body isn't.
Yeah. And recognizing that how we were, you know, mentioning that it's not universal, how we respond to those traumas. And again, this is something we can talk about more when we get to community care. That has to be a part of the conversation, because there are ways in which we might perpetuate harm, or have a lack of grace or understanding for people, because we're not recognizing that different people, different communities, different cultures have different ways of dealing with trauma and responding to things. And to personalize it, I think about the fact that like I, as a result of trauma in my childhood and abuse in my childhood, have this deep well of anger that really sits in me and is like right at the surface at all times. It's like having another being in me. If anyone's ever watched the show Dexter and he talks about his dark passenger, it's my dark passenger. They're just always with me, and it's painful. And I realized that, you know, when I was living foster care, when everybody was kind of flying off the handle, if I wanted to go off on somebody, I could go off on somebody. It didn't matter. Like, I mean, it mattered, but like everyone was doing it. You can't do that in quote unquote polite society. And so I had to learn new mechanisms, and it took me years to cultivate the coping skill where instead I essentially shut down. I become sort of non-responsive. I become very quiet. I become detached in a way that now I realize folks who don't understand my trauma background or my response are reading as like, well, she just doesn't care, or she's just cold and detached. And it was heartbreaking to me to get that feedback from some folks and realize the thing that I spent years trying to learn to do so that I wouldn't do the thing I was already told I wasn't supposed to do is now also the thing I'm not supposed to do. And yet no one's working with me to find something new. So what do I do with that?
I think I'm grateful that you said that, because I think about how like all of that's cultural, right? And like we have to have a conversation even in trauma and burnout and what's acceptable, like, and palatable for some people by ways of like the manifestation of that trauma or burnout is about dominant culture and like what people find to be palatable. Because there are things that I've witnessed, right? Like, so I've seen some like super like acerbic things happen, like just where people just like really nasty, but they're like nice nasty. And because it fits into like somebody's understanding of what is civil, it's acceptable. But where like if somebody gets like loud real quick, if my voice gets up, now I'm being threatening. Like, nah, like me being threatened,
aggressive and looks nice, that's okay.
And so like we can never get away from like speaking about like how culture and dominance and like empower like play into these things, because there are socially acceptable, y'all see the air quotes for those of you who are watching, like there are ways that certain people, like based on their identity, their trauma responses and their, you know, manifestations of burnout are seen as being acceptable, whereas so others of us, we aren't afforded those same things.
I want to pivot a little bit, if you're okay with that, and kind of move the conversation around commodification, a couple different things. So commodification, distortion of self-care. There's a number of things within that I want to talk about, because you know, you talked about how we joke about self-care sometimes feeling frou-frou. We're also talking about it sometimes just feeling very vapid and capitalistic. And so it's everything from the like, I'm going to take an hour off from my day and go take, you know, get a mani-pedi or whatever it may be. I'm going to a spa. My self-care looks like throwing $300 down to get my hair done, or I'm using a lot of seemingly gendered things. I actually don't want to do that, but can't think of other examples right now. But spending spending money on ourselves is not the only way to engage in self-care. And I think there's actually something we need to push back on, is this idea that self-care requires a certain monetary cost.
Yeah, self-care doesn't require capital. Like, I know for me, like, one of the greatest acts of self-care that I have engaged in over the last 2 years is affording myself silence.
Yeah.
Like, stilling myself and not, like, you know, leaning into, like, you know, people's understandings of like what productivity is and should be, and just like being still and being quiet and having nothing but like my fan on. Like, I don't need like TV. I mean, like, Netflix is awesome, but like turning off the Netflix, like putting down the book and just being quiet, being still, and like hearing myself. That is free 99. Like, there's no cost associated with it. And I think that in, you know, in a world where like self-care is increasingly marketable and like and then profitable, it's important to understand like the ways in which like we can like resist that by reminding ourselves like, what is care for us? Like, what makes us happy? What gives us joy? What allows for us to like, you know, take hold of our wellness? And how can we do that without there being some type of monetary cost attached?
Yes. So it's the making it profitable. And I'd like to use the word marketable, because I think it's also, there's a toxicity attached to that, not just in that it's inaccessible because of funds, but I think about some of the things that are now labeled self-care. A lot of this, like FITSPO, what is it called? Like fitness inspiration stuff, where it's like, it's your teas and it's your workouts and it's making your body look as good. Like, and that may be a way for you, but like the idea that these are necessary. What are you going to say?
No, it's an industry. Like, there are people who build entire industry for this.
Yeah. So I think we need to push back against that, because again, the word that's important here is accessible. Because if our general understanding of self-care is not accessible, it's useless to us in terms of sustaining the movement and caring for one another in the way in which we should care for one another. It doesn't mean you can never spend money. You know, Alicia uses her example of, you know, free 99. Mine, for me, is super cheap because I don't have a lot of money, but it still costs something. I love going to a movie theater, picking the movie, I don't care how bad it is, but picking the film that is the least likely to have anybody else in the theater, that has been out for weeks, to try and get in there and sit completely alone in the dark for 2 hours is one of the best things for me. I usually do it right after I go to therapy, because I just need to be away from every other person, sort of even myself, just sit in the dark and be invisible for 2 hours and alone. So, you know, that might cost me $15, and for some, even that's inaccessible. So we need to realize that it's different things for different people. Also within this is this conversation around cultural appropriation.
Lord.
So I was going to use it as an example earlier, and I realized I wanted to save it for this, because there's, you know, do the mani-pedis and all of that, but then there's also, I'm going to start a drum circle and get, you know, my dream catcher tattoo, and I'm going to do, you know, like, whatever it may be.
Yeah, it's true.
Buy it on the stage. So then now other folks, it's endangered, and other folks can't get access to it who are actually of Native heritage, whatever it may be. Like, there's not, if your self-care acts are going to be just, the question of appropriation needs to be approached.
Absolutely. Because, you know, it's not, I think that there's a difference, not even I think, there is a difference between cultural appreciation and cultural appropriation. And like, when people are like not honoring the traditions from which something comes, right? Like, one of the first things that anyone says when you start talking about like self-care, have you tried yoga? It's like, well, how many of you are actually invested in like, in not just like yoga, like in terms of like the physical practice, but like the spiritual disciplines,
right,
and cultural histories that are connected with it? And there aren't a whole lot of people who could say that they are. I mean, there are increasing numbers of folks, you know, people of color in particular, who try to honor like, you know, the culture from which this comes. But like, you got a lot of folks doing this and just, they've taken it. It's like, it's taking and using and profiting off of something that has existed for millennia. And that's sacred to folks. And like, you've now made this thing like that's sacred commodified, and that's an issue.
Absolutely. So there needs to be this conversation around cultural appropriation. How do we make sure that our acts of self-care are inherently just acts, not just towards ourselves, but towards the greater community?
Absolutely. Because talking about your sweat lodge in Brooklyn, and, you know, when like we're still not in a place where we're having conversations with like how to honor like Native folks. Like I saw something like on in the news recently about a young Indigenous person having their photos of like their regalia, like for like their graduation, being taken off the internet by whatever social media platforms, and but you're posting these pictures about the sweat lodge, like it's not just no.
Well, I think of my friend Jolie, who started the organization Indigenous Women Hike, and it's not just about reclamation for her own people and for Indigenous women and in the hiking culture, but she does a lot of work around educating and correcting non-Indigenous communities that have been trampling Indigenous land for hiking culture, or giving names to that land that aren't what the Indigenous people call it, and really erasing their presence, their current present, because they're still there. So even in that, like hiking, one person is like, oh, this is my self-care, going on a hike, blah, 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 and doing it in a way that erases Jolie or harms Jolie's community is not a just form of self-care
at all.
So the other thing we talked about, not to push us forward too quickly, is the idea of generational differences in care, particularly for POC and immigrant communities. Do you have some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think about like all these emerging conversations just in my own family around like therapy. And so I remember, I could just like talk about it like throughout the course of my lifetime. So like when I was younger, like therapy was like a thing that like we did not speak about, like as Black folks and like, as Black Americans, like with like Caribbean ancestry, like just no. And, you know, I think about, you know, just like, you know, mental health conditions like within my family where people could have benefited from treatment, but like didn't afford it to themselves because of stigma. I mean, and some of that stigma, you know, may have been grounded in something. I remember having a conversation with someone in my family about like not pursuing care at one point in time because they were afraid of it being weaponized against us, like as people of color. Like if it ever were found out that we had like taken these things, even though like white folks had been engaging in these practices for a long time, being Black and like and going to therapy or like getting treatment for X, Y, and Z would have potentially like stopped us from being able to take hold of opportunities. But what's like been cool though is like now that I'm in my 30s to like talk to these same people and them starting to understand the need to have conversations like with a counselor and to like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of like some of the conversations I've had with like family members. So like, you know, counseling definitely is one. Like we talk about like hydration, right? Like people ask, are you drinking enough water? Like, you know, or something's happened. It's like, well, what is your water consumption been? Like these things that have been kind of popularized in like conversations with care with my peers. I'm now starting to see these conversations happen in my own family. And it's a good feeling because it wasn't that way 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think about the idea for a lot of communities of color, and I really, it's not strictly immigrant communities, but I also think for a lot of immigrant communities, I'll speak for Latinx people, and there's this idea of like, there's a couple different components, and we're not a monolith, but some of the arguments you'll see against things like therapy and mental health care, which is a form of self-care, a crucial one, also not a super accessible one, is in the Latinx communities often very taboo, whether it's because of religion. So pray it away, have more faith, you know, take it to Jesus, take it to the cross. Or if it's, you know, that's white people problems. That's like this idea of like, we are too tired, too busy, have too much to do, and too much weight on our backs to be worrying about white people problems like mental health. Depression is not a real thing. Like these kind of arguments. And I think of folks like, and that's usually not, that's often coming from older generations within our community, because often because they truly did not to give us the opportunity to think about things like this, they were overwhelmed to the point where things like self-care and mental health were not conversations that they had the capacity for or any resources for.
Absolutely. And I think that what you're saying about resources is like super like key. I'm thinking about like what it means to be like maybe 4 generations removed from enslavement. Like, was master going to pay for the therapist? Like when people, like, it's like, you know, like I read this article recently about like enslavement for like African descendant persons, like existed like well into the 60s here in the United States. But like that being said, it's like we're dealing with, you know, like generational trauma and like violence that it still continues. And you know, so we go from like, you know, enslavement, then we like, you know, deal with like Jim Crow, and then like, you know, the manifestations of like racialized violence that we see in our country now. There are all these ways that like people coming from cultures that like sought to dominate others kept those resources for themselves. They kept it away from us and then demonized it. Like, you know, like within our communities, like it was seen as being, I mean, I'm wondering if like if some of this is like people thinking like, you know, we can't afford to appear weak because appearing weak means that our family doesn't stay together. It means that like you're taken away or I'm sent away, and it like meant a fractured or family unit. And so like, it's not just that we have to get, you know.
Well, if we're supposed to work twice as hard to get half as much, you can't look weak and do that.
Nope.
And saying you need care looks weak to some folks. I do appreciate when it comes to things, to this conversation in POC communities, folks like Diora Vargas, in particular for Latinx people. She's someone who's been advocating for mental health conversations and destigmatizing them in Latinx communities, and for POC at large. But you know, her passion is our people, and so there are folks, younger generations, who are trying to help move all of our community along because we know that we need this, and to varying degrees, we finally have the capacity to get it. And so I'm really appreciative of folks like that. I want to move us on to our last part of this evening's conversation, which is this idea that self-care is community care, or needing self-care and community care. And so the first question that when we were thinking about, you know, how we were going to do this, that came to mind, that really just hit me now when I read it again because of everything that is happening in our world right now. And I don't even mean the greater world. I mean in the POC and or LGBTQ community right now. The question of, can your community be trusted to hold you? So we're talking about community care. And there's a number of things we want to talk about. How you're proactive in this, how there needs to be intentionality, the systems that need to be created, all of these different things. But can I just start with, what does that evoke for you, the question of, can your community be trusted to hold you?
I mean, that's a complicated question because a lot of times like the deepest wounds that we have come from our communities. You know, I think about like, you know, the trauma that I carry like in my spirit and my body, and some of that's a good portion of it is like, it's familial. Like my first community, you know, is one that has hurt me. Then I like, you know, I branch it out and like go into like religious spaces. Shit. Like I've gotten hurt, really hurt in like in religious spaces, and like have degrees of religious trauma that I've had to like navigate through over the years. And so the answer to my question for that is, can your community be trusted to hold you? Sometimes. But I think that for me, like the answer to like that has really been rooted in me understand, or maybe like reorient myself to like what community is and what it needs to be. Like I'm realizing that there are bonds that I had that were like superficial, whether it be that like, hey, we're family, or we're in the same like context, and that may be my community. Like, nah, like community for me nowadays like has like a way higher standard than what it had in the past. Like community is, are you for me? And like, you know, and you being for me has some type of like action behind it. It's not that you're just here saying that you're here, right? Like one of the things we talked about in the past was the concept of allyship. But like community, like in the similar ways, like as allyship functions, it's not something that you tell me you are, it's something that I tell you you are after you've proven that's who you desire to be to me.
So let me narrow the prompt down a little bit, specifically, not just what is your answer to this question, but why does this question matter? Why do we need to ask this in terms of our community as our movement spaces define it? So the people we're doing the work with, why does the question of can the people you're doing the work with be trusted to hold you matter?
Oh, Jesus. I mean, it's still such a big question.
Yes, I tried to narrow it down.
I mean, it matters because we're all we got. Like when you have like a world that rages like around you and you have, you know, people who you don't know and who you aren't invested in and who like genuinely are working against your sense of well-being, there have to be people who you can turn to who not only like work to see you be well, but affirm, celebrate, and then go tell you to go like prioritize your wellness. I mean, I think about like our relationship, right? Like, so y'all don't know this because you don't be on the phone and in our texts, but like the two of us are like quick to tell each other to be like, you know what, you're doing too much, like go sit somewhere. Or, you know, to do like wellness checks, like how are you today? Like, well, what does that mean for you when you say that you're this? Like, do you need space? Do you need to talk right now? But that's because we're community and we've proven that we're community to one another.
I mean, it's both beautiful and really sad to say how unique my experience with Alicia was last week when this session was originally scheduled, because my depression and anxiety issues were sort of in peak form last week. And then I went to therapy right before it was time to do this session. I don't know why I thought that was a great idea. And so I came out of it realizing that I just had nothing. I don't know how I would have been able to do this, and feeling like I couldn't and wasn't allowed and was failing Alicia and anyone who was participating if I said I needed to step back for the evening and I needed to reschedule. And so I reached out to Alicia, really scared of, not because I thought she's judgmental, because I know her, but just the anticipated judgment of being someone who's supposed to be doing the work, saying I can't do the work. And the degree of guilt that I already felt even before I'd contacted her. And then to have Alicia respond with, I'm proud of you, take care of yourself, what do you need? And I'm trying to work out the details of like, how do we fix this? And she's like, we'll deal with that later. It was beautiful and uncommon, and really sad in how uncommon it is for folks to respond in that way to each other. One, you shouldn't be afraid to tell the people you're doing the work with when you need something. Two, the people should be ready to respond with, how do I care for you? Not, here's how you're failing me. Like, this shouldn't be an anomaly. It should be the norm. So, and I think in there, one of the things that we touch on is this idea that we named of there's a pride issue, a pride component to why we don't do community care well. Me not being able to ask and name what I need. And this expectation that you would like pride in your work looks like always being available, always being able, at 100%, down for the cause, you know, here for the movement, at your own expense if you have to, that, and you should take pride in that, rather than be like, that's unhealthy. I'm rambling. Thoughts on this, Alicia?
Well, I mean, I think that like we can even like, you know, shift from speaking about like individual pride to organizational pride, because like entities take pride in the fact that like that they're able to like do things efficiently and whatever, but it's like it comes at a cost. And if you're like running an org, like whether it be nonprofit or like corporate or like whatever it is, but like your people aren't well, like that's not something to take pride of. Like you could have like all the productivity in the world, but if like people are not okay, it's a problem.
If you have a revolving door because your 5 people are doing the work of 15 and everyone's celebrating you for it, there's something wrong.
And like, and the inevitable result of all of that is that you're gonna crash. Like you're gonna disengage, you're gonna experience burnout. And it doesn't take but so much. It's like, okay, so, you know, like using the example that like Anna Chelsea so like vulnerably shared about last week, like, it's like, okay, so we have to like push back and we have to reorient our schedules like next week. Like, I'd rather us do that than like to push my friend, like this person who I'm like invested in and who I love to bits. Like, I mean, I love this woman, like for real. But like, I'd rather like us take an L, which it's not, but like for people who like maybe prioritize certain degrees of productivity and like efficiency and timeliness or whatever, like they may perceive it as a L. I'd rather like wear that on my chest proudly and make sure that my homegirl is all right. Because at the end of the day, her taking that time and like, and me celebrating her taking that time means that we're able to show up both together, right? Like, because there was an option that I did this show without her, and no, like this is a project that we said that we do together, that we've dreamed of together. And so we get to do that with you now because we both did what we had to do to make sure that she was okay and that we're okay, because she is a part of this week.
Thank you. So this sort of tangentially, I'm trying to make a segue where there might not be one, to our next point, which is that there needs to be a prophetic and just component to how we practice community care. So with the prophetic, I'll say what I mean by that, is we need to do what Alicia just did, and what the example that we're sharing, which is speaking what should exist, even if it currently doesn't, even if we're not sure how it's going to. We need to speak into what it should look like. What is our capacity right now for community care, for truly caring for one another, but what would it look like at its greatest point, at its purest fulfillment, so that everyone is cared for, so that no one is falling through the cracks, no one's walking away or being lost, and I mean literal lives, because we weren't prophetic in how we're going to do this work, and then holding ourselves accountable to this possibility that we named. Even if that possibility might include loss of some productivity, loss of certain standing, or bragging rights, or things to take pride in. The new thing to take pride in is how we're caring for our people in a way. So we need to be prophetic in naming what it could be, what the vision for truly like engaging in community care looks like. And within that, making sure that it is just, and again, I keep throwing these words out and I'm just going to keep using them, that it's accessible and it's sustainable, and that it cannot be static. We already named. What I need may not be what Alicia needs, may not be what the next person needs, or the next person needs. So we have to be willing to hold it a little loosely in our hand and recognize that it's going to shift and take different forms from space to space and person to person. Alicia?
Absolutely. And I think that another facet of the prophetic is not just speaking to what could be, but what is, and like why it is that way. And so the prophetic tradition, like, I think, kind of regardless of like, religiously, like where you come from, like prophets or herald, they're people who speak truth. And that truth, yes, it's like a future truth, but it's also like a current truth. And so part of, I think, self-care and community care is a part of that, is speaking about like complications or like obstructions to that care, and naming them, like, hey, like here's a thing that's like a roadblock to this. So how do we like lift it up and remove it in order for like the freedom of that care to just kind of like be dispersed out?
Yes. So once we're doing this, we're being prophetic, we're naming what is and what could be, then there needs to come the intentionality. How do we create the systems to get to this thing that we've envisioned, or to sustain this thing that we currently recognize as good and necessary? So I want to give you, I feel like you speak beautifully about creating systems, give you a chance to say a little bit about what does intentionality look like around that?
Yeah. I mean, I think what's so dope about like creating systems is like we have the opportunity to like to kind of make things like as we see them, as like we vision them, as we dream them. And like, I mean, we talked about like divestment from the commodification of like care. It's like, what do you already have? Right? Like, so one of the things I like to tell people as a facilitator when I go into a place, it's like the wisdom and the resources for like what needs to happen is already in existence here. It's like my job is not to give you new things so much as to help you fashion tools to dig up what already exists. And I think that that's what this work is. That's ultimately what all of this is we're getting at. Like, y'all have got it. Like, you have it. But like, what does it mean to think about what you have and take inventory? It's like, okay, well, I may not have a lot of money, but I've got time, and I have a physical space, and I have food, or I have the ability to make food, or I have a car. Like, just be aware of like what all like you possess, And then how can it be utilized? Like, it's like that simple. Like, coming up with systems and like vision for things is like really that simple. It's like, what do we got and how can we use it?
I love that idea. Just to put my business out there one more time, when I was in that therapy session last week, I was talking about how well my partner cares for me, and the fact that it's in he's awesome. But that it's in his nature to care in that way and to be attentive. If you're an Enneagram person, Enneagram 2, someone who's receptive or very keen on noticing people's needs and wanting to meet them, having a sincere desire. And so because I tend to be self critical, the way in which I shared this with my therapist is that's who he is. I'm just the one that's exhausting and I don't know how to do that and I'm bad at it. And eventually, like, they're going to realize that they're putting more into caring for me than I'm putting into caring for them. And her response was, and I said, and I was also like, it's not just with them, it's with everybody. That's why folks leave. And that's why, like, I have abandonment issues. So that, you know, like, that's why these things happen. And her response was, she's like, I would argue that you actually care for people really well. I think it looks different than you've been told care has to look. And I don't know that I believe this yet, but I'm sharing it because I want to believe it. It sounded really good. But she said, for me, caring for people, whether it's in my intimate relationship or whether it's an act of community care, looks like while the ones with giftings like my partner are attending to the wounds, I'm the one standing in, like, between them and whoever caused the wound and just ready to throw down and ready to fight, ready to ask what's wrong with the system. How did this happen? Will give my all. And she's like, that is an act of care. And so my point in naming this is not to be like, I'm a warrior, but, but to say, for us to recognize what Alicia is naming, which is we have these things already in the room. They're already in our movement spaces. We have to broaden our definition of what community care can look like and not expect that everyone's going to provide it in the same way, and instead cultivate the different giftings that people have so that when it's time for them to step up in the way that is needed, they can and be appreciated for what they're doing. So I thought, again, I'm still trying to internalize what she said, but in terms of this conversation, it sounds really good.
And so it's a part of Anna Jelsey's community. Now that I know that this is what her therapist said, like, I have the ability as a form of care to call her back to this. Because, like, she just named that, like, self-care is like holding this to be true. And so, like, my affirmation and the community care that I will provide her is reminding her of the self-care. It's all cyclical, y'all. It's like it all goes together.
Oh, beautiful. Okay. I'm gonna get a little teary-eyed. I might still be emotional from last week. But that was really the note that we wanted to end on, was just broadening our understanding of self-care to something greater, whether it's self-care and community care or self-care including community care, whatever language you want to use, recognizing that this is not a solitary act, both in meaning that it's not something you do one time and meaning it's not something that you do alone. It's something we do as a community. It's something we do consistently, that we do with intentionality, that we do with parameters for what it looks like, and that we hold it, we don't hold it too tightly, and we recognize, again, that it takes different shapes, different forms. Do you want to offer a last thought before we go to our private conversation, Alicia?
I do. And all it is just like a little bit of an abbreviation of what you just said. Self-care is something we do with. That's it. It's something we do with. You're not alone. Like, you are a part of a community, whether that community is something that's in person or it's, digital, or a combination of those things. And I'll even, like, kind of show my hand in terms of like what my beliefs are. It's also the community that you share with those who are no longer with us. Like, your ancestral community is definitely a part of the community. It's like all those who have gone before you and even those who will come after you. Like, you are in self-care is something that you do with. And like, if you take away nothing else, like, from this time, I mean, I hope you take plenty of things away from this time, but if you take nothing else, like, I want you to, like, to hold that. It's something that you do with.
I love that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So So with that, we're going to move to our after hours, Kiki, which means you don't get to see it because it's not recorded. But before we say goodbye, I want to remind you that our next session in June is our final session. It's the conclusion of this series. So it's going to be Grind Until You Own It, Strategies for Holistic Approach to Justice Work. And we're going to talk through those words I keep using, accessibility and sustainability. So we'll see you on June 20th at 7:30 Eastern if you're joining us live. And if not, you'll see it when it's available to everybody. Thanks for joining us. Have a great evening, everyone. Bye.
Take care, y'all. Bye.